Yeah, adding those things up.
I might have sold my life to the highest bidder, but words have spoken for it. You'll find the shape of that life traced like a fossil fern in the vein of words, black as a seam of coal. That's poetry. And I don't like it either. There are things, as Marianne Moore said, that are important beyond all this jill. But then she also said, reading it with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. So I would like for you to listen to what I have to read with perfect contempt for it. If you don't find anything in it you like, you're under no compulsion to like it. It occupies a curious place in our culture. Jeremy Bentham said that he didn't know how to recognize poetry. He said, the only thing I know is that when the lines run all the way to the right-hand margin of the page, that's prose. When this fails to happen, it's poetry. You must keep in mind that Bentham was the founder of utilitarianism. And people are always trying to express a certain unease about poetry. There's a definition of modern poetry, which is the kind of poetry that's taught in universities. And it's not a bad definition when you think about it. The U.S. Congressman Paul Simon of Illinois said that we are the only country, as far as he knows, where it is a matter of embarrassment rather than pride to be able to speak another language. And he goes on to say, I sometimes say that you can go to a reception or a cocktail party, and there are three things that you can claim no knowledge of at all, and it will do you no harm at all. You can say you know nothing about opera, poetry, and foreign languages, and it can be a source of pride rather than embarrassment. And of course, here I am, someone who writes poems and teaches a foreign language. It tends to make you feel rather peripheral. But we're involved in some work here this summer in our fellows program, in our scholars program, where we're trying to see a unity behind both the liberal arts, the humanities, and the sciences. And that unity is found in imagination. And for that reason, I'd like to point out to you that Robert Oppenheimer, who had so much to do with the development of the atom bomb, famous physicist, not only read French poetry, but he read it in the original, and he wrote some poetry. And when one of his physicist friends found out about this, he wrote him a letter. And he said in the letter, I understand that you're writing poetry as well as working at physics. I don't see how you can do both, because in science, one tries to say something that no one knew before in a way that everyone can understand. Whereas in poetry, he never finished the sentence, he didn't mean to. Well, I hope it won't turn out to be that kind of experience where I'm trying to say something that you already know in a way that is incomprehensible to you. But unfortunately, that has been the experience of so many people in the 20th century, and if you don't have a historical perspective of poetry, and why should you necessarily, you get the notion that poetry is difficult and dark, and that all poetry is like something that T.S. Eliot wrote, whereas that is a divergence from the tradition. And of course, now it's not only poetry, but the poet himself or herself, just the figure of the poet is problematic. A man named John Love asked a group of high school sophomores in New York State to write down what they thought a poet was. And here are some of the things he got back. A poet is an elderly sissy, who tries to be famous and sophisticated by using syllables to sound smooth. Another student in that same class said, I think a poet is an egg-headed platoon who wears a sheet over his body and walks through the fields talking in rhyme. It's getting close, isn't it? I said, I think a poet is a boring old guy with a wrinkled mug who stays inside all day in Greenwich Village on welfare. He's got a sack of pencils and a bunch of scribbled on papers all around his desk. Another one says, a poet? I don't come on many. I would be shocked if I saw one. It would have a beard, notice the neuter. It would have a beard, be messy and weak. Another one said, about 62, stuffy, got time to look around, owes money. And a girl wrote at the bottom of her paper, do you think you can profit from going around speaking poetry? Doesn't it take up your time and bore your whole life and ruin your girl relationship? Those are some of the not altogether, they may be a little extreme, but those are some of the notions that people have about poets and poetry. And yet in that same class, some amazing kinds of insights, because one of these young students wrote about an image. An image is a vision expressed by a series of false statements. Which is okay, I'll go along with that. I can work with that. Yes, all right. I can say that a poem is a vision expressed by a series of false statements to the extent that it is fictive. It is a fiction. This is what Marianne Moore had in mind when she says in her poem that I quoted from that begins, poetry, I too dislike it. She finally gets around to this notion. Poets must be literalists of the imagination and present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Imaginary gardens with real toads in them, which is not too different from William Carlos Williams' definition of a poem as a vision of the facts. Most people think that facts and poetry belong in separate categories, but they don't. And of course, a vision of the facts is not unlike what you get in a good hypothesis, which is an abstraction which explains a lot of particular data. So you see, we are moving into a realm where poetry and what a scientist does have a common source in the imaginative insight into things, into matter. Vision of the facts. E.B. White says that a poem is religious in tone and scientific in attitude. Religious in tone and scientific in attitude. And here's a pretty good working understanding of how you can judge poems. A good poem contains the seed of wonder, but a bad poem, like an egg, stinks, like a rotten egg. I may inadvertently perpetrate one of those on you. Maybe I already have. But I want to give you a criterion by which to judge the poems that you're going to hear, and I take it out of Bronowski, who again says that finally you judge good science in the same way that you judge good literature. The test of imagination, Bronowski says, is experience. That is as true of literature and the arts as it is of science. In science, the experiment is tested by confronting it with physical experience. And in literature, the imaginative conception is tested by confronting it with human experience. The superficial speculation in science is dismissed because it is found finally to falsify nature. And the shallow work of art is discarded because it is found to be untrue to our human nature. So when Ella Wheeler Wilcox, for instance, died in 1919, more people were reading her poems than were reading Shakespeare's. Yet in a few years, her work was dead, buried by its poverty of emotion and its trivialness of thought, proved to be as false to the nature of man as Lamarck and Lysenko were false to the nature of inheritance. So you see, he believes that you can judge good science, good literature, by essentially the same test. Well, we'll see. Keep that in mind. We'll reach an early point. Some of you who've been listening to poetry and hearing people talk about poetry probably heard someone say that practically all lyric poetry is about two subjects, love and death. Here's a poem about death, about a funeral. I'm talking, and I've just lost a grandfather. Graveward to this green tent, I too came burdened. Though other hands than mine, none more willing, waited to man metal, grips, and to bear him briefly through this rain of newfound hill. Walking beside the water-beaded coffin, I saw how feet schooled in these hills of yours climbed on the rutty clay. Where others slipped, they didn't even soil their Sunday shoes. In Doggett's Gap, by Double Springs, where we made camp, we knew another tent, another time, squirrel time in the bear wallow, and rain rolled from our blue-barrel rifles. Climbing the hill head down behind you, I marked how wisely your feet held fast on the slippery rocks. So there's that green undertaker's tent on a hill, a funeral in progress. And just a little similarity noted between how water beads stand on that coffin and how once water beads stood on the barrels of rifles in a hunting camp back over in western North Carolina against the Tennessee line. A little exploded metaphor. And then, a day or two later, these poems tend to be a little lyrics strung on a kind of implied narrative thread, so that you pick up the storyline at different points in it. This grieving speaker now is at home, and he's had a visitor. Ryle Sams came by, but now the house is still and cold with dread. Unless this weather breaks, I look for another grave on Newfound Hill. Rain rumbles on the roof, splashes from the eaves, and foams and bubbles into tubs below the spouts. The barn, the shingles on the crib drip black with rain. Spring house mosses grow frog green, and Hanlon's top is lost in the mist. Ryle Sams climbed Hanlon with his hounds last night. But when they wended something below the top and wouldn't go beyond the lantern light and trembled on the lead, he came home. I trust the hounds. They know what made them stop, what waits there in the mist on Hanlon's top. It's a spooky poem, a dread poem based on an old superstition that deaths may come in twos or threes. This man says, unless this weather breaks, I look for another grave on the Newfound Hill. There's something up there that frightened those dogs. These are early poems. I sent them off one time, a sheaf of 10 of them, to a magazine called The Writer, published in Boston. There was a woman named Maxine Kuhn, who has since won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry, who was conducting the Poetry Workshop, which was a column that runs still in that magazine. And she didn't notify me, but a few months later, I picked up a copy of it when I was down in Nashville on Church Street and walked down the street in July and opened bringing it up to the poetry workshop, which I always read, and there were my poems discussed. And she was the first person who ever had made any critical comment about my poems, and from that time they have been associated with a particular place. Because of some of the comments, she said the detail in this poem, even without the cumulative bolstering of the other poems, quite easily conveys its setting. This is hill country, hunting country, and the proper name, Ryle Sands, and the place names like Newfound Hill, Hanlon, evoked to me, she said, a backwoods section, the Ozarks, possibly. That really could have been the Ozarks, sure. But those place names happen to come from western North Carolina, and the scenes, while they might have been from the Ozarks or from Kentucky, but here's something that I think nobody would ever suspect about many of the details in that poem. Some of them came from the news, and not from my direct experience, but from reading. Not long before I wrote this poem, I had been reading Hawthorne's collection, Mosses from an Old Mass. And to make my poem, I quite consciously borrowed some details from this passage in Hawthorne. All day long, and for a week together, the rain was drip, drip, dripping, and splash, splash, splashing from the eaves, and bubbling and foaming into tubs beneath the spouts. The old unpainted shingles of the houses and outbuildings were black with moisture, and the mosses of ancient growth upon the walls looked fresh and green, as if they were the newest things and afterthoughts of time. The usually mirrored surface of the river was blurred by an infinity of raindrops, and the whole landscape had a completely water-soaked appearance, conveying the impression that the earth was wet through like a sponge, while the summit of the wooded hill, about a mile distant, was enveloped in a dense mist where the demon of the tempest seemed to have his abiding place and to be plotting still direr inclemencies. Well, I maintain that this passage that I read was something that happened to me. I experienced that passage no less than I experienced grief over my grandfather's death. And in the poem, I put these two experiences together. You also plagiarized, you might be thinking. You stole Hawthorne's tubs and his spouts and his moss. You even took his hilltop. Yeah, but I left him his river. And his Latin diction, which wouldn't work for my speaker in my poem. I couldn't have a fellow speaking out of western North Carolina saying things like, still direr inclemencies. And what I took, I combined with my own barn and crib, my own spring house, my own neighbor, Ryle Sands, my own foxhounds, my own Newfound Hill and Hanlon Mountain. I couldn't have made a poem, even this little one here, just from the details that I borrowed from Hawthorne. The poem is a combination of those things, and that's what creativity involves in practically any art or in sciences. It's combinations of things, putting things together. That's what thinking is. It's making connections. Now, I'm not worried about taking those details. It's home. T.S. Eliot says that a poet differs from a non-poet in this way. A non-poet may fall in love and then read the philosopher Spinoza, and the two experiences won't have anything to do with one another. But a poet will put them together somehow, falling in love and reading Spinoza. John Donne did that all the time, and was criticized for being too intellectual in his amorous poems. And Dr. Johnson said he was trying to show off his knowledge to these women that he was trying to pay compliments to. Yeah. Well, there's that place. There's that place. And I didn't know it at the time. I was writing poems. I didn't have any of these thoughts that I'm trying to pass along to you folks in the seminars. Nothing having to do with heritage, tradition and the importance of the past. And yet, can anybody tell me the title of a movie that was made several years ago that starred George Peppard in a military land roving kind of vehicle in which he went across the country with a young man after a nuclear attack? That's the plot. George Peppard is probably, like several of George's movies, not a lot of people saw it. Maybe nobody in this room. I saw it. And there was a scene in there where they go by this giant junkyard of automobiles. There's just acres and acres of old junked automobiles. And the young man who's riding along in this vehicle with Peppard says, "I never saw so many cars before." And Peppard says, "That's your heritage, Billy." And Billy says, he's a young fellow, he says, "What's heritage?" And Peppard says, "What people leave other people when they find out it don't work." That's a typically American view about the past. It's cynical, it's utilitarian, and it's wrong-headed, I submit to you. Utterly wrong-headed. It smacks of that history is bunk view, which was held by Henry Ford, the old pragmatist who gave us all those automobiles. You know, he's supposed to have said history is bunk. And someone passed this information along to Arnold Toynbee, the historian. And Toynbee, without hesitation, said, "Yeah, and now Ford is history." I think it's worthwhile for every one of us in this year 1984, the year identified with George Orwell's book, which, by the way, has no particular significance. Orwell submitted his novel to the publisher with the title 1948, and they thought that was hitting a little close to home. He thought these things he was writing about were already in place, and they just turned the numbers around. So don't worry about Big Brother. It has nothing to do with 1984. And you don't worry about it this year any more than you should next year. Put it that way. But in this year, we ought to think about the uses of the past and the uses of history, and if there's anything useful in the collective experience of our Appalachian region that is different from George Peppard's definition of heritage. Is there anything in it that works, that's worth keeping? I tell you, I had my eyes opened by Allen Ginsberg, the dissident Russian journalist, who told me in an interview when he came visiting my school over in South Central Kentucky. He said, what they did in Russia in the revolution was to destroy the past, to kill off memory, so that people couldn't remember any other way of doing things, so that there would be no alternative to what the regime had to offer folks. And he said, you know, it chilled me when I was in Cambodia and saw the same thing happening again. Killing the past, killing off any other alternatives and ways of life. That's one obvious use of the past, and that's one reason why we should remember. Well, I didn't know all this stuff, as I said, but I didn't realize that the past was working in me. And I was not a particularly good vessel of it. Many other people were much better vessels and carriers and bearers of it than I was. But it was working in what my old teacher at Vanderbilt, Donald Davidson, says in his book on the Tennessee River. He said the people who settled this region brought with them an invisible baggage, which consisted of what we call oral material, stories and songs and riddles. They just brought it in with them in their heads and in their memories, an invisible part of the baggage that came with them. Little innocent things that you associate with children and would not necessarily be the important things of adult life, and yet they are. Little riddles like what? Marble walls and curtains of silk, a golden ball and a river of milk. And you guess what is it? It's just an egg. But it's a metaphor for an egg. You have to think metaphorically. You have to think in pictures. You have to see that a riddle consists of a metaphor with one half the metaphor submerged. Marble walls, like the shell of the egg. Curtains of silk, like the little thin membrane inside that. A golden ball, the yolk, and a river of milk, the white of it. And riddles are always little proto-poems. Little metaphors with one part of the metaphor sort of stuck under the rug. And you're guessing the metaphor, the answer to the riddle forces you to think metaphorically. Song. Here's something that take you back. See if anybody can place it. Well, Jane was in labor for 3 days or more. She grieved and she grieved till she grieved her heart sore. She called for her mother came o'er. Said the red rose of England will flourish no more. Now this thing goes on just as long as you want it to go on. Well, Jane was in labor for 3 days or 4. She grieved and she grieved till she grieved her heart sore. She called for the doctor came o'er. Said the red rose of England will flourish no more. And then, of course, you can bring in the nurses, they grieve. You bring in just all the other relatives and so forth. And finally, though, it always ends like this. Well, Jane was in labor for 6 days or more. She grieved and she grieved till she grieved her heart sore. She called for Prince Henry. Prince Henry came o'er. Said the red rose of England will flourish no more. On the internal evidence, what does that have to be? Anybody know? Gary? Scott, that's Henry VIII, and that's Jane Seymour. And of course, she did die about 2 weeks after she gave birth to, was it Edward VI or something like that? And what's this red rose of England business? That's the War of the Roses. Yeah, the Lancasters were, their symbol was the red rose, and the Yorks were the white rose. And that house eventually established the Tudor dynasty. And of course, if you think the Hatfields and McCoys were feuding, you ought to go back and read what went on between those two families. They feuded for years, and it was feuding. And so, yes, that's an old song. That's an example of that stuff. And I learned that over in Northwest Buncombe County. You know what it was all about, but it was easy to learn. You can see why. It's the same thing over and over. Well, this was not so easy, and I never set my mind to learn. I realized one day I learned it. This is, there's 47 different versions of this, and this one there's Little Margaret. And if you've never heard this ballad, you've heard one that's so similar to it because the motifs wander from story to story. Tragic love. Little Margaret was sitting in her high hall home, combing on her long yellow hair. She saw sweet William and his new made bride going down the road so near. See, in the dialect you can rhyme hair and year. She threw down her ivory comb, she threw back her long yellow hair, said, I'll go out and bid 'em farewell, never more go there. It was so late in the night, when they were fast asleep, little Margaret appeared all dressed in white, standing at their bed's feet. Well, how do you like your snow white pillar, and how do you like your sheet? And how do you like that fair young girl, fast in your arms asleep? Well, do I like my snow white pillar, well, do I like my sheet? Much better do I like that fair young girl, standing at my bed's feet. Must have been one of those political marriages. That's a confession he makes there, you see. He's called on serving men to go and saddle the dappled roan. He's rode over to her father's house, knocked on the door alone. Is little Margaret in the house, or is she in the hall? Little Margaret's in her cold black coffin, her face turned to the wall. Once he kissed her little white hand, or lily white hand, it's been corrupted. Once he kissed her lily white hand, twice he kissed her cheek, 3 times he kissed her cold, cold lips, and fell in her arms asleep. Now, you won't find Corby in the dictionary, but you know what it means in that context. Full of grammatical errors, he's rode over to her father's house. But it's a good, artful, swiftly told story. It just goes jumping along almost like scene to scene in a movie film clip or something. It's a combination of song and story. Stories. Like this. That reminds me of this carnival they had up at Newport one time. There was a fella up there had this ape or gorilla, never what it was. Stood about so high. It was nigh tall as Jimmy Young. They had to where you could put on boxing gloves and get in this ring with him, and if you could stay in there with him 3 minutes, they'd give you $50. Well, these old boys I was with, they kept at me and they kept at me, and I had this little old gal on my arm kept looking up at me like a Polax cat. These old boys egging me on. Anyways, I got to studying this here ape, and I thought, well, he ain't as big as I am. They had him up there on a chain. I remember he was sitting on a stool eating a head of red cabbage. Directly, I raised my hand, and I told that fella I'd try him once. Well, they got us back there and got the gloves on me and all, and this fella that owned the ape, he told me, he said, now, don't hit him too hard out there, because if you do, you make him mad, you'd be in real trouble. I thought to myself, well, he's just trying to save his ape whooping. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to protect his investment. Anyways, I come out and climbed in the ring, and I felt pretty much like a fool. All my buddies out there hollering and going on, and I looked down at this little gal I was with and gave her a big wink. About that time, they brought the little ape out. Had a muzzle on. He kindly looked me over. Well, they called out our names and everything. I forget what the old ape's name was. And this old boy rung a big dinner bell, and I stepped out and circled the old ape. Showed him a little footwork. He didn't look like he was going to do nothing much, so I reached out and busted him one. He just kindly looked at me. Well, I didn't do nothing but square off and hit him again. Popped him right in the side of the head. And when I done that, his old head jerked back. His eyes went kind of funny. And I said, well, how sweet it is. I done spent that $50. So I ducked around and went in to hit him again, and about that time he jumped right on top of my head. And he crammed his foot in my mouth. And like to tore my jaw off. I couldn't even holler for help. I thought they never would get that thing off. Now that's the oral tradition. You know, it's very, very carefully crafted, and some of you know where it comes from. If you don't know, I'm going to tell. But it is the oral tradition that's been worked on a little bit. This tradition is as old as that old song about Jane Seymour. It's as old as that story about Little Margaret. But let's face it, those themes were probably written by very talented, gifted people who hung around the courts of the time, or the Nashvilles of the time. And then these things went into the oral tradition. Oral tradition doesn't mean these things just grew up in woods like mushrooms. It means that people thought enough of it to remember it for 400 or 500 years. And it got changed and worked on as it came down the generations, the way a rock coming down a creek gets rubbed over and gets smoothed out. Now this story is a traveling story. It's been all over this country. And you can go out tonight to Draper's and buy a book by Jan Bronebond called The Disappearing Hitchhiker and Other Urban Legends. And you can find 40 or 50 stories just like this one. But Cormac McCarthy put this one in his novel, Child of God. Where did he get it? He got it from down here somewhere in one of these bars. He heard it. He didn't invent it. But that's the problem. The oral tradition supports the print tradition. It gets up into the print tradition all the time. And it's hard to separate them out. Well, I know that some of my poems have this narrative element in them because I grew up listening to that stuff. Knowing it and didn't even know I had it. And here's another poem that belongs to that sequence about the old man. He's dead now. And I used to work with him in fields and garden plots. And when we hoed tobacco or corn together, I'd take a row, he'd take a row. Somebody else working with us, each one of us had a separate row and hoe it out to the end and turn back and hoe back. Sometimes you duck over the hill. But when we worked in little garden patches, like when we hoed Irish potatoes or sweet potatoes, I noticed we didn't do it that way. We stood opposite each other in the row and worked on the same row. And I would be reaching over this way with my hoe and getting dirt from right around his shoe tops. You see, right around his shoes. He'd be reaching over. I was usually barefooted. And I had to watch my toes to keep that hoe from nicking. And so we would pile dirt up on each plant as we worked, standing up and coming up in that way. And sometimes we'd strike with our hoes in the same direction, in the same place, and we'd get them tangled up. We call them gooseneck hoes, and that crook out there, you see, they all get tangled up, you big clatter of metal and so forth. We'd have to stop and disentangle like two fighters. And that happened one time, I remember it clearly. And when that happened, he said, that's a sign. What? I said. He said, when we get our hose tangled up like that, that's a sign. Of what? I said. He said, that's a sign that means you'll be working the same time come another year. Which was a beautiful thought for me. I didn't want to, there was no prospect at all. Didn't want to be there, so it was not a poetic experience. Or a mountaintop experience. Not at all. But later on, I remembered that. There's no effort to remember it. I made no effort to. And after that man was gone, and I went through a period when I was in lots of places where we'd been together, and I had this sense that he would be there. I mean, I'd always turn and out of the corner of my eye, I'd always expect to see him. It was one of those situations where he was conspicuous by his absence. And so in my imagination, I took this old superstition, this belief, and again, because of something I've read. I've been reading Goethe's, Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe, the German poet, philosopher, dramatist. And Goethe, in his old age, practically everything he said, Eckermann took down, words of wisdom. And he said at one point that poets ought not to disparage superstition, Aberglaube, beliefs and things, because these things are already a kind of folk poetry. They have metaphorical structures and they're full of symbols and things. And I thought, yeah. And I remember my grandfather's belief. And so in my imagination, I put myself back out in that field. He's not there, and I'm a poet. I'm by myself, and this is the little poet, me. My shadow was my partner in the road. He was working the slip-handle shadow of his hoe when out of the patch toward noon there came the sound of steel on steel 2 inches underground. As if our hoes had hooked each other on that spot. Why, my shadow's hoe must be of steel too, I thought. And when my chopping hoe came down and struck, memory rushed like water out of a rock. When 2 strike hoes, I said, it's always a sign they'll work the patch together again sometime. An old man told me that the last time ever we worked this patch, and our hoes ran together. But delving there with my hoe, I have uncovered a plow point, worn and rusted over. The man I hoed with last lies under the earth, I said, his plow point, and his old saying of equal worth.
my shadow standing by me in the road, waited, and while I rested, raised his hope. So again, it's a little ghost story, almost like Margaret, dressed in white, standing at the foot of the bed. And only later, as I say, did I realize that all that old stuff was working in me. And I wouldn't have written that ghost story like that, I'm sure, if it hadn't been for the possibilities in those old ballads, where that tradition comes down. And another kind of insight is this sort of thing. I realized that as I lost people, that this business about place was an illusion. I was not interested in place as locale. I hope you won't find any dim-witted yodeling about mountains in my poems. Because it's not the fact that there are mountains that make the poem. It's the notion of people in that place. Because I noticed something about places where when I would lose somebody like my grandfather, and then the grandmother, and then other people in that community, the place wasn't the same anymore. And it was those people that made it. And so I did a very, and I think most people do this, we do irrational things. We know how to use the Cartesian paradigm and to keep things neatly separated, our minds from our surroundings. But we're forever confusing our place. We have feelings, emotional feelings and attachments to people and places. We merge our identities with them, as I did in this little poem called Light Leaving. My mother was 16 when I was born. We grew up together. Now I'm older than she is. The one thing never changes. Night always falls, drifting over fields, settling softly on the tops of trees, like my mother's black hair falling over her neck and down her back when she loosens her combs in the evening. The landscape and the person have merged there. Well, that goes all the way back to the Greeks, the old soul bird. The bird symbolizes the soul, but it means there's might be a death. This is called Birthing House. In a dogwood winter of grief, he always turned from fresh graves into another country. Because subtraction of lives from the land altered fields, changed weather, shortened seasons, and made him no longer a face reflected in the cool springs of their eyes, made him a sudden stranger to himself. He turned always knowing that their lives had bounded the country he had known. The rounds and routines of their days, little seasons, familiar weathers, certain as rosebuds, fall apples, or first frost, their rooted lives like great trees his summer shade. Their stories on the porch at night, like rain on the roof, like lines in the palms of their hands, paths that they made from house to barn to field, got lost in weeds and never came home. Fields and buildings turned their backs on one another. A hill eroded down to white limestone, like flesh fallen from bone. And he always turned away with a heart fluttering, like a sparrow beating its wings at a window inside the empty house. Beyond the baffling hard transparency were cedars, fenced fields, light, air, all country he came from. But he can't get back into it again, you see. He's alienated from that sort of thing. So a person like this, somebody who wrote a little article about my poems said, these poems read as if they were written by somebody who went to sleep in a folk tale and woke up in a drama of the absurd. And of course, maybe that's just, maybe that has nothing to do with our time and our place. Maybe that just has to do with growing up and moving from childhood to adulthood. That's always like going to sleep in a folk tale and waking up in a drama of the absurd. And I see a lot of heads. Yeah. But maybe there is something very that has happened in our part of the world.
It has rather quickly been inundated by a very contemporary sort of scene within the lifetimes of many people. Around who remember the first automobile that came, almost the first train, and then suddenly there are atom bombs, and then suddenly there's McDonald's, and there's bypasses, and there's shopping malls, where cows were just grazing the grass a few weeks ago. All of a sudden, cash registers are in. That whole business is part of our collective experience. And so that is something that people share. I know that it's not exclusively an experience of this place, but I tried to get at that one time. I just saw a headline in the Nashville Banner, I think it was. It said, "Small farms disappearing in Tennessee." I didn't even read the rest of the story. I knew that. I came out of that world. I knew why they were disappearing. But I thought, I just like to tell that story in my own way, using a literary technique that might be something like time-lapse photography, where you speed everything up and you get this sense of the absurd into it, which is what I felt. And so I wrote a poem called "Small Farms Disappearing in Tennessee," and gave my credit there. It's a headline. And here's all there is. Sometimes a whole farm family comes awake in a close, dark place over a motor's hum to find their farm's been rolled up like a rug, with them in sight. They'll be shaken onto the streets of Cincinnati, Dayton, Detroit. Why, it's a ring, a syndicate, dismantling farms on dark nights, filing their serial numbers smooth, and smuggling them north like stolen cars, disposing of them part by stolen part. Parts of farms turn up in unlikely places. The weathered gray boards from a Tennessee Burley tobacco barn are up against the wall of an Ohio office building, lending a rustic effect. A Tennessee country church suddenly appeared disguised as a storefront in uptown Chicago. Traces of Tennessee farms are found on the slopes of songs written in Bakersfield, California. One missing farm was found intact at the head of a falling creek in a recently published short story. One farm that disappeared without a clue has turned up in the colorful folk expressions of a state university buildings and grounds custodian. A whole farm was found in the face of Miss Hattie Johnson, lodged in a Michigan convalescent home. Soil samples taken from the fingernails of 4 plant workers in a subdivision near Nashville matched those of several farms which recently disappeared in the eastern end of the state. A 70-acre farm that came to life in the dream of a graduate student taking part in a Chicago-based dream research project has been put on microcart for safekeeping. And divers searching for a stolen car on the floor of an Army Corps of Engineers impoundment discovered a roadbed, a silo, a watering trough, and the foundations of a dairy barn. But efforts to raise the farm have proved unsuccessful. A number of small Tennessee farms were traced to a land developer's safe deposit box in a mid-state bank. After a bank official entered the vault to investigate roosters crowing and cows bawling inside the box. An agricultural agency of the state recently procured a helicopter to aid in the disappearing farm phenomenon. People come in here every week, the agency head, Claude Bullock, reports. Whole families on tractors, claiming their small farm has disappeared. Running the small farms arm of the agency is not just a job for Bullock. He was born and brought up on a small Tennessee farm himself. "We're doing the best we can," says Bullock, who is a soft-spoken man with a brow that furrows like a well-plowed field over blue eyes that look out at you like farm ponds. But nowadays, he adds, you can punch a farm, especially these little ones, onto computer cards. You can store them away on magnetic tape, so it's hard to locate them with a helicopter. Bullock's own small farm, a 30-acre remnant of the old home place, disappeared 14 months ago, shortly before he joined the small farms arm of the agency. So Mr. Bullock, he's hustling too, isn't he? He's doing what all the rest of us do. Well, I figured out, and I'm going to be closing here with this, I figured out that somebody was writing these poems that wasn't me exactly. I don't sound like that all the time. And I had in mind somebody who wasn't me, but it was somebody who had this kind of experience. And I came across a cycle of jokes up in Cincinnati and Dayton and places like that were little idiot jokes applied to southern mountain people who were up there for the first time, and who obviously were in town for the first time in their lives. They were immigrants in their own country. And it's pretty much the experience that you're going to be seeing next Tuesday in the Dollmaker film. People like Gertie Neville and her family who went out of this region somewhere else. Well, the man in those jokes is referred to as a briar. Southern Appalachian people north of the Ohio River are known as briars. And so I just took this fellow and let him sort of recapitulate the experience of the whole group. And here is the briar losing touch with his traditions. See if he doesn't look and sound familiar to you. Once he was a chair maker. People up north discovered him. They said he was, quote, an authentic mountain craftsman, unquote. People came and made pictures of him working. They wrote him up in the newspapers. He got famous. He got a lot of orders for his chair. And so when he moved up to Cincinnati so he could be closer to his market, besides a lot of people of his own people lived there now, he found out he was a briar. And when his customers found out he was using an electric lathe and power drill just to keep up with all the orders, they said he was losing touch with his traditions. And his orders fell off, something awful. He figured it had been a bad mistake to let the magazine people take those pictures of him with his power tools, clean shaven, wearing a flowered sports shirt and drip-drop pants. So he moved back down to East Kentucky and had himself a brochure printed up with a picture of him using his hand lathe, bearded, barefoot, in faded overalls. And then when folks would come from the magazines, he'd get rid of them before supper time. So he'd put on his shoes, and his flowered sports shirt, and his double-knit pants, and open a can of beer and watch the 6:30 news on TV out of New York and Washington. You had to have some time of being said.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for a wonderful experience. I'm sure that Jim would welcome any comments that you might have or any questions you might have. Is there anything that anybody would like to ask? Or well, again, let me compliment you greatly, Jim. I congratulate you. That was a wonderful evening. Let me remind you all that the exhibit is available down in the gallery